Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm super happy to welcome back returning guest David Johnson. I'm trying to think when you were on the show before. It's been almost a year, I think, maybe more. So welcome back, David, to Mind Shift Podcast.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Oh, man, I'm excited to dive into this topic that we're going to be talking about, a Christian defense of slavery, and I'm sure that's going to lead us down a lot of rabbit trails. But recently, I've been on your new show because you used to host the Skeptics and Seekers podcast, but as I understand it, you're no longer doing that. What are you doing nowadays in the podcast world?
Well, I'm actually still doing Skeptics and Seekers, but it's a little bit different. So it's Skeptics and Seekers Sunday Sermon, 4S.
Right.
And what I do it as a solo show most weeks, although from time to time I will have a guest. But the thrust of the show now, rather than a conversation between a Christian and atheist, is I play a sermon every week, something from, the Christian side of things. And it's either a sermon, sometimes it's a discussion. I don't mind doing some other type of lecture, but it's a Christian talking for a while. And I commentate.
Right. You break it down. Yeah.
Kind of a Pine Creek style thing with a sermon every week. Sometimes it's a modern sermon. Sometimes it's a classic sermon from someone like Billy Graham. But the idea is to actually show people what it is Christians are saying, what they're teaching from the pulpit, what they've been teaching from the pulpit forever. This is a no straw man zone. Do not accuse me of straw man.
Right. Hey, let them speak in their own words.
I let them speak in their own words. This is literally what they are saying. Right. So if you have a problem with it, you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with them. Now, oftentimes that show, that's the sermon that I'll do that week, has something to do with the subject that we've talked about on Red Letters. You mentioned that. Patreon.com/Red Letters if anyone's interested. You can pick up a free copy of my book there. Red Letters, a closer look at the worst practical and moral teachings in history. It's a good book. Grab it for free.
If you do say so yourself.
$1 a week, and you can cancel anytime. You can still keep the book.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been on Red Letters a couple times.
It's a great book.
It's a great book. No bias whatsoever. You're completely objective, David. There's absolutely zero bias coming from you right now. I'm not sensing any. I don't know what you're talking about. But yeah, I've read the book. We've been on Red Letters a couple times in the last few weeks as we're doing this recording now. I've thoroughly enjoyed breaking down what we talked about. Why you think Jesus is not necessarily the greatest teacher that ever lived. And then we talked about family values, which got us into all kinds of stuff last week when we did that recording. So really enjoyed talking with you. And then we had Andrew Knight, isn't it, who was also on.
Yes.
Which I think he's a frequent guest. It was a little bit off-putting. It was ironic. He was on a like a mobile phone, a cell phone, in the park with his daughter. So talk about family values. He didn't want to miss the podcast, but yet the sound quality may not have been the greatest. You said at one point, are you milking a moose there or what are you doing? He was pushing his daughter on a swing while he was trying to talk.
Yeah. Andrew has certain, he does a podcast of his own, still unbelievable. You can find his stuff at reasonpress.net. And you can see some stuff there. You can see, lots of stuff like that. But he doesn't sweat audio quality in the way that I do. So I'm an old audio engineer guy. And so I care about it in ways that most people just don't. They're incapable of caring. In fact, we're late on the show because of various audio things. And so I'm doing something right now that most people wouldn't do just to get better sound quality. And if you take the audio that I send you by email, it's going to sound great.
Otherwise, it'll sound better than mine.
Normal guy. And that irks me. So he doesn't care about any of that. And
he doesn't sweat it.
Right. He's got other things to prioritize. And I can tell you one of the secrets to great audio is how much money are you willing to sink into it?
That's true.
Not much.
Not a red cent. A mobile phone, and that's pretty much it. At the park, I was absolutely fine. In his book, yeah, I'm not as like, I'm not as hardcore as you, but I'm trying to improve my audio as much as I can with the budget that I've got. So yeah, that's kind of where, in fact, you were giving me some helpful tips last week. So I think that's improved, hopefully just a little bit, my audio.
You sound.
So thanks for that. Yeah.
I try not to harsh on people for audio issues. Most people are not professional podcasters or broadcasters or have any background in that, and they just have something to say and they're passionate about it, and they get on the mic and say it.
It's true.
That's fantastic. Grab a mic, say something, and share it with someone who cares.
Yeah.
So let that be the first priority. If you want to build an audience, however, you're going to have to do a little bit more.
It's true. Yeah. So I'm working through those issues now, but getting back to our topic now, this is my sort of context. So we talked about a year and a half ago in that podcast. We kind of dipped into the history of racism and the Christian church, and you had some fantastic resources there. You've obviously studied that. And one of the stories you told in that episode was how you were in a museum in the South, somewhere in the South, and you came across an authentic KKK, Ku Klux Klan robe. It wasn't a replica. It was the real deal. It had been worn at cross burnings and probably lynchings and other things. That story, I think, is one of the most powerful stories I've ever heard, to be honest with you. And I got a lot of feedback from people that just said, when I heard that, it was chilling when you talked about trying to convince your friend to put the robe on and he didn't want to do it,
Worse than the robe, it was the hood.
The hood, actually, yeah.
Yeah, it was, it chills me to think about it even now. And, I knew he wasn't going to put it on, but I teased him a little bit and pushed him. And we both, had a little bit of a feeling of nausea almost. It was so visceral as we looked at the thing. Words couldn't describe it.
It's an emotion, a deep emotion. So this is how I got interested in this subject. After we talked, I listened to a podcast. If anyone ever listens to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, I'm a huge fan of history. I love Dan Carlin's show. He did a show several months ago on the slave trade, and it was about probably 5-6 hours long. Classic Dan Carlin 5-6 hour episode. In that episode, he was talking about sort of the general overview of the transatlantic slave trade. And he started getting into Frederick Douglass and some other former slaves who had written biographies of their experiences. And the thing that struck me about reading Douglass was that he was talking about specifically Christian slave-owning masters and overseers, and they were some of the cruelest and meanest and harshest people he'd ever come across as a slave. So then I went and found Douglass's book, which actually you can find the whole audiobook for free on Spotify. So I listened to the whole thing for free on Spotify, and I've read a few other books by ex-slaves as well since that time. And then I've come across a guy, I've done a lot of research on this guy named Doug Wilson. Now, he's a pastor out of Moscow, Idaho. He runs Christ Church. He's building sort of a cult-like empire. Now, he wrote a book, I think it was in 1996, with a guy named Stephen Wilkins. He was the co-founder of this League of the South, which is a racist sort of neo-Confederate organization. They wrote a book called Southern Slavery as It Was, and that was a kind of a full-throated Christian defense of slavery. So that's kind of where I'm at with this whole thing. And I wanted to tap you as a resource because obviously this is in your wheelhouse. You've done loads of research on this subject.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Yeah. So this is the context that I'm working through, and I've gone into this thing it's down a rabbit hole, but what I found is I read an article by a couple of Canadian scholars a few years ago, and it was on this subject called the theological war thesis. So have you heard of the theological war thesis?
No.
Okay, so what the theological war thesis is, this is basically a Christian defense of slavery by really Southern Presbyterian pastors and theologians before the Civil War. So when slavery was being questioned by abolitionists and so forth in the North and in other parts of the world, these guys came out with a full-throated biblical defense of slavery, and their sort of portrayal of the American Civil War was that they said, well, it was Northern aggression. The North was heretical. The North was godless. The South was actually the only true Christian nation left. We're a godly nation, and slave owning was all part of that. It was all sanctioned by the Bible, and they've got verses and verses and verses they trotted out to prove, in air quotes, that slavery was sanctioned by God, condoned by the Bible, which it really actually is. And so they said the war wasn't about economics or anything like that. It was Northern aggression against the godly South. And even after the war, this gets picked up by guys like R.J. Rushdoony, the founder of Christian Reconstructionism, and a few other people. And it's now made its way into Christian homeschooling curriculum. It's made its way into Doug Wilson, who is a kind of a Christian Reconstructionist. And so that he has this homeschooling curriculum empire. So these ideas are going into, right now, as we're talking, into the Christian homeschooling world. They have been for a long time now. So these are my concerns, among others, that you got generations of Christian homeschool kids who are being exposed to this sort of neo-Confederate idea, and there's an inbuilt racism, obviously, in the whole thing, which I think you must have a lot to say about.
Well, yeah. Let me ask you a question, though, on this war theory.
Yeah, theological war thesis.
Yeah, the theological war thesis. So, if it's Northern aggression, what was the North aggressing for? It's because it's not like the South had many rich resources or a strong economic system. The truth about the Southern economic situation during the time of the Civil War was that they were dying on the vine anyway.
Yeah.
Slavery was never a sustainable system. It was a terribly bad system, and the cotton gin was a useful thing. Cotton was the big cash crop of the South. Some say the cotton gin actually prolonged slavery longer than it would have. Mm-hmm. It would have died under its own weight because it's not a terribly sustainable economic system. And so the South was already in pretty bad shape, and they didn't have anything that anyone would envy. So in this theory, what was the North aggressing over? What were they, what would have been the point?
Well, what the argument is, it's a theological war. So this article it's a couple of professors, Sebesta and Haig, and they say the theological war thesis is defined like this, quote, "It is an assessment that interprets the 19th century CSA, Confederate States of America, to be an Orthodox Christian nation, and understands that the 1861 to 1865 U.S. Civil War to have been a theological war of the future of American religiosity fought between devout Confederate and heretical Union states," end quote. So that's the actual theological war thesis. So out of that comes the ideas like the Confederate flag, statues. These are actually symbols of Christianity. So if you reject them, you're actually rejecting Christianity itself. So they've recast the whole thing as a theological war. It's not necessarily about slavery per se or economics.
Very strange thesis, I must say. I don't want to get stuck here.
Stuck in the weeds.
We're already
in the weeds. Oh, right. Let's go further into the weeds then.
I think this idea that somehow the North wanted to go to war with the South over theology,
yep,
is utterly absurd. The North wasn't all that theologically motivated anyway, any more than they are today. So the South, they were theologically motivated. And so one could imagine the South going to war over theological reasons. It is incomprehensible that someone would think that the North would have gone to war over strictly theological reasons.
Yeah, but that's how in a way, they painted themselves in a corner. And the thing is, before the war started, these guys were already articulating. And I think there's an article that's really interesting. If you've heard of David Barton, he runs an organization called Wall Builders out of Aledo, Texas. He's probably the leading Christian nationalist, quote unquote, historian in America today. He goes all over the country giving talks about how America was a Christian nation, and he's got all these quotes from the founding fathers and the signers of the Declaration and the Constitution to prove that America was a Christian nation. Now, on his website, he has an article, and it's a really interesting thing because the problem that the article presents is, he says, a lot of people will say, how could America be a Christian nation and allow slavery? How could God bless America and allow slavery? And so you can see right away this issue has been raised many, many times before. America cannot be a Christian nation and have slavery. Therefore, if slavery is condoned by the Bible, if it's okay in God's eyes, that then gives all the argument, all the weight to say, yeah, America was a Christian nation. God had no problem with Southern slavery. And in fact, if the North was going to come against the South for theological reasons because the North was heretical, now you got a problem, so they can recast the whole thing.
Well, okay. That's a stretch, South. But okay, I guess. And I will say something that may sound a little scary or radical to the hearer. So here comes the first radical thing out of me. There's actually no good theological reason why slavery shouldn't exist.
You mean biblically?
Biblically, yeah.
Right, yeah. The Bible condones slavery, in other words.
Well, yes, not only did it condone slavery, but it didn't do anything to condemn it down the road. So there's no reason to think that God would have changed his mind on that. There's actually no good reason for the Christian today to be anti-slavery. Now, I'm glad that they are anti-slavery, but theologically speaking, there's no good reason for a Christian to be anti-slavery. And so if you just kind of sit with that thought for a moment, I know that that's going to lead you into some of your research about Christians who indeed are proponents of slavery. They actually theologically have the right of it. And Christians who make anti-slavery arguments today are actually straining and I think contradicting the text to do it. So I've immersed myself quite a bit in Christian anti-slavery arguments, because what older Christians used to say about slavery was, well, God condoned it then for those people in that place. So good for them at that time in that place, not good for us in our time in our place. So it was a situational thing. That was kind of the old positioning, but the new apologist comes at it in a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm.
They would say, or at least many of them would say, no, actually, slavery wasn't good for them at that time in that place either. In fact, the Bible never condoned slavery. So that's the wrinkle. So it used to be that, it's so obvious that the Bible condoned slavery.
Yeah.
Christians would just own the fact that the Bible condoned slavery, but then make an excuse for it. And today, that doesn't work, because the rejoinder to that is, okay, so if your God could have been that wrong about something that big at that time, there's no reason for me to think that he was right about anything. So the Christian understands that argument can't win to say to actually condone slavery, and so they take a tack of saying the Bible never condones slavery, and so all those passages that you think you see slavery in, you actually don't. It's not in fact condoning slavery at all. It's a kind of a gaslighting technique, and they have a few ways of doing it. Maybe we'll talk about that along the way. So I would just, my response to them and to your audience is, look, the new apologists are way more wrong than the old apologists. And just from a theological point of view, I'm not a God believer, but I've spent my life studying the Bible because I was in that world for so long. There is simply no good reason to be anti-slavery from a biblical theological point of view. You can't do it, and every attempt to do it leads you into either a really bad argument or just bad logic or dishonest thinking, or just saying something factually wrong about Scripture. And as we go along, we can kind of look at some of the ways that they try to avoid that conclusion.
Yes, exactly. And this is the problem. You mentioned kind of the issue of the biblical inerrancy. That was your illusion, biblical inspiration, inerrancy, because what you find when I read through Southern slavery as it was, the argument that Wilson and Wilkins are the line they're going down, it's not really so much a full-throated defense of slavery, although it is that. And I'll read some quotes later on that are quite shocking about how they're glossing over how bad slavery was. But their issue is, as biblical literalists, if you allow any crack in the Bible's inerrancy, infallibility, authority to appear, you're in trouble. And therefore, you have to defend slavery because it's condoned in the Bible, right? And they say in their book, I'll read an interesting quote. They say, quote, "If those who hate the word of God," meaning atheists and liberals, "can succeed in getting Christians to be embarrassed by any portion of the word of God, then that portion will continually be employed as a battering ram against the godly principles that are currently under attack. In our day, 3 of the principal issues are abortion, feminism, and sodomy." And so they won't call gays or homosexuals, they say they're sodomites. And what they're arguing is, we can't allow any crack in the Bible to appear. Therefore, we are now compelled to defend slavery in the South as godly and biblical.
Right. And that's what I actually call the old apologist approach. So that's the logical conclusion to the old school way of thinking.
Right.
The new apologists, once again, they deny slavery ever happened to the Bible, or that it ever condoned. So that's the thing that
right.
That you're having maybe a hard time grasping, because you're thinking, how could they deny it? I mean, it says no, they can, and one of the ways that they deny it is to redefine what slavery is. They redefine the words. Oh, well, you hear slavery and you think Southern slavery, and that's not what was going on in the Bible at all. That's not what God was condoning at all.
It's more like indentured servants and that kind of thing. Was it chattel slavery? And
right, that's one of the things that they will try to do if there's time and if you'll permit. I'll look at. We can take a closer look at some of that, but I want to actually pursue this line of thought. The line of research that you've been on, because that's something that's new to me. I went through and I read some of the sources that you linked, but still fairly new to me. That there is a fairly modern movement of people who feel like slavery could be defended, a form of biblical slavery for today. Now, theologically speaking, that is correct.
Yeah.
That is social suicide. You can't say that out loud and have any credibility in this world. And so it is new to me that people are saying that out loud and gaining credibility.
Absolutely. And like I say, Rushdoony and then later on Doug Wilson, these were not the first people to champion this in the 1960s and 70s. So it goes a little bit deeper than that. And that's the issue, is that, Wilson and Wilkins, there's so many problems with their book academically and all that, because for one thing, okay, Stephen Wilkins, I mentioned before, he was a co-founder of the League of the South, which is a neo-Confederate racist organization. It's been called a hate center by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so what happened, there was such a firestorm over this book that Wilson dropped Wilkins from that edition, took it off the shelves, republished it with a kind of a sort of a what's the word, and a historian who has more credibility, and then republished it, and it's now called Black and Tan, and it's a longer, sort of more historically nuanced book. Because the problem with Southern slavery, as it was, for one thing, they were accused of gross plagiarism. They stole large sections verbatim from another book called Time on the Cross, which was another book in the 70s that was written that was debunked by historians. And what they do, they just quote a guy named R.L. Dabney, who was Stonewall Jackson's chaplain, and they just quote him completely uncritically. And he's, of course, defending slavery as being, it's a wonderful institution. These slaves don't know how good they have it. It was fantastic. We just loved on them. They loved the masters back. It was great. I don't see what the problem is, so it's a gross misreading of history. And that book has been absolutely slated by real historians. But like I say, it's going into Christian homeschooling curriculum.
That's a scary idea.
It really is.
Let's look at some of the pro-slavery arguments that one might make. I know that they have made some of these. I read countless articles on people defending biblical slavery, not defending it in a way that they're saying that it should come back today. But I suspect that these same defenses are coming up again. And so it's not just, in case your audience is thinking, well, it's just a simple, point to the Bible. The Bible has it. The Bible's God's word. God's word is good. And so it's okay. All right. That's there, but that's overly simplistic. There's more fueling it than that. So one of the things that is fueling it, and you can actually get all of these from the Bible too, but socially, these are some of the things that fueled slavery and the defense of slavery, is that the enslaved people are guilty of some type of deep, systematic, maybe even genetic sin. Now, in the Bible, this would have played out as the curse of Ham.
Mm-hmm.
So, for those not familiar with the curse of Ham, Ham was one of Noah's sons. Noah, when they hit dry land and the waters receded, he went and planted a vineyard and got stinking drunk, got naked. Ham looked upon his father and made fun of him. We can talk about the nuances of
what actually happened.
Had been going on there, because this is very euphemistic language. But the Bible says he saw his father's nakedness. As if this is a
shameful thing.
So his brothers came in backward with a sheet so that they wouldn't see him
in his drunken state.
Right, but Ham, because he saw him, he was cursed by God all of his generation with being slaves to the other two sons. And since these were literally the only people on earth, it's Ham's descendants and everyone else's versus everyone else. And so part of the thought process with some of the people is that dark-skinned people are Hamites. And so they bear the curse of Ham. They bear a particular sin that is common to their race. And so it is a right thing to enslave these people, not only because God said that these people were to be slaves, but also because everybody knows that these people are extremely sinful in some specific, often unnamed way. And so it is better for a Christian nation to capture and enslave them and bring the salvation message of Jesus to them that way, than to let them go on unaffected by civilization and die in their sinful state. So that's one of the justifications.
Right, so it's ordained by God in a way. This is just the curse of Ham playing out in history. God ordained it. There's really nothing we could do about it. It's just the way things are.
Right.
That's kind of how it goes down.
It's not right. It's not their fault.
Yeah.
They were born that way. I heard people speak this way, when I was an adult. They were born that way, so it's not their fault, but it's our responsibility to make sure that they stay in line. We can't just let them run amok. So that's one of the things that people will say, kind of in a defense of slavery type thing. Another thing that people will say is, well, but slavery is a system that gives people who otherwise would have been down and out, it gave them a chance to live. If you think about people who are in war-torn parts of the world, so you go back to ancient Israel and biblical times, and nations were always warring with each other, and not every nation fared so well in war. So the Israelites, they were protected by God, so they won all the wars, and the nations around them, they were devastated. And so if left to their own devices, they would have just all died of homelessness and starvation. It was actually God's mercy.
Right. We're doing them a favor.
You're doing them a favor.
You're helping these people
by enslaving them, and then bringing them into your system. And now they've got 3 square meals and a roof. They're so much better off. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Right.
Under the system of slavery. And so the way Christians would talk about slavery, the way Jews would talk about it then, the way Christians would talk about it now, would be slavery as a kind of a form of welfare. So, if you didn't enslave these people, their lives would be worse. So that's another justification for slavery. There are one or two others, but did you want to comment on either of those? Are you familiar with these lines of arguments?
Yeah, I've heard about the curse of Ham being the black skin and the slave thing, or the dark skin. The other one I was going to say, going back to your point, there's a secular argument as well. This is something I learned from the Dan Carlin episode. I'd never heard this, that he talked about during the Renaissance, when they were discovering ancient Greek and Hebrew, or Greek and Roman Latin manuscripts, that they realized that the Greek and Roman societies were built on slavery. It was a common thing. And the Enlightenment thinkers said, well, listen, we wouldn't have all these great advancements in civilization, all the philosophy, the medicine, the architecture, the mathematics, and all these things that the ancients, because they had time on their hands due to the slave system. They didn't have to work manually in the fields and in the factories and down in the mines and all. The slaves did all that work, thereby leaving the thinkers, the philosophers, the really educated people time to give us all these great advancements in society. So on that level, they would also say, what's wrong with slavery? It's just a God-ordained system, and certain people rise to the top, certain people are just going to be slaves, and that's just the way the Romans would have said the gods, but the Christians say God has ordained it.
Well, yes, and that's not entirely a non-Christian argument or non-biblical argument either, because I think the ancient Jews would have probably said that God chose us as his special nation. We are a nation of priests, and so we have a special relationship with God and a special responsibility to the rest of the world as your priests. And so we, God put us in this position. He didn't set us apart so that we could work our fingers to the bone. That's what you guys are for.
Mm-hmm. That's just the system,
right? That's just the system and
God's economy.
One of the things that Christians will say, I know that you've heard this before, is that while God didn't invent slavery, he made it better. The Jewish slavery was a better form of slavery,
right? Newer and more improved.
Right. It was a new, improved slavery over the slavery of the peoples around them. And so when God's people enslaved people, it was actually a better system than the one the people would have had. So this is kind of the thought process. And yes, you are right. The people who have the talent to think and build and
philosophize.
Philosophize, right? They should do that. And the sacrifice that the rest of the world should make is they should be the laborers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So these are some of the thought processes, and it's easy to say, well, these are secular arguments, but actually all of these kind of secular arguments are echoed biblically as well. And so it made it easy for Christians to use these types of arguments because they were all pretty well supported in Scripture. And then I'll just give you one more from the New Testament. The New Testament, the problem that Christians face there is that Jesus didn't abolish slavery. He not only didn't fail to abolish slavery, he didn't say anything negative about it.
That he didn't take a stand or anything.
He didn't take a stand. Now, he took a stand on lots of things.
That's right. I was just going to say
controversial things. He had time to take stands on things that either didn't make a lot of sense or just didn't matter.
Right. So why not this one?
Yeah. So why not this one? And so the Christian has to kind of answer that one. And their answer to that is, well, Jesus didn't come to overturn the social systems and political systems and economic systems of the day. Jesus was all about repentance and salvation and getting people in right relationship. And so the things that the abuses and atrocities by evil governments like Rome, Jesus didn't come to overturn Rome. He didn't come to save you on your taxes. He didn't come to do any of that. This is kind of the argument. And another thing that goes along with that argument is he wanted to change the system from within,
right. The grassroots thing. Yeah, eventually a slavery will be abolished in a Christian system.
Right.
From the grassroots up rather than from a top-down political sort of thing.
Right. The problem is it's just completely false. All of that is just completely bass-backward false, and it comes from a person who has not studied Jesus at all.
Right. So how do you really feel about it, David? I'm not sure we're getting this.
Did come in part to overturn the systems of the day.
Yeah.
He did that all the time. He did it when it came to marriage. He said, you know what? Moses allowed divorce. I say no more divorce. No. As if he could change the law. He has no power, but he's overturning this system of the day. And then if you ask the progressive Christians, well, why did he change divorce? Well, he was trying to establish something that would be better for women. Great. Okay, so he's overturning a system to establish something that would be better for women, but not for women slaves.
Or women in abusive relationships.
Right. He doesn't want to overturn that system. What about the system of family? family was an important Jewish system. It was maybe the most important Jewish system. I would argue that this has been an important system today. Jesus, absolutely everything that he did was to overturn the way people thought about family. He was absolutely into overturning that system. He was fine with that. Slavery,
got nothing.
Right. So this idea that somehow Jesus was apolitical and that he only cared about love and forgiveness and salvation and repentance, but he wasn't trying to make any major social change, is absolutely absurd.
Right. Well, then you got Paul. So then the next logical step is, well, here's Paul. All of his epistles, he turns around and says, slaves, obey your masters as unto the Lord. Masters, treat your masters, treat your slaves with respect and all that. But if you're a slave like Onesimus runs away from his master, he sends it back. Says, go back to Philemon, go back to your master. Don't seek to run away. So Paul didn't overturn the system either. And yet he was a Roman citizen, if we read the text historically. So he knew the system inside and out. He never took a stand either. In fact, he told slaves to continue to serve their masters and not seek to be freed.
Also, whoever's masquerading as Peter. There is also instruction to not just obey your masters, but to love your masters, even when they mistreat you.
Yeah, and even the cruel ones. Yeah,
even the cruel ones. And there's a line. It's a chilling line. It says, if you if you think of God and you can bear the pain, he is pleased. Peter is talking about the worst forms of slavery you can think of, and he's telling the people who are slaves, not only should you not escape, you should have deep feelings of love for the people who are mistreating you.
Yeah, and
this is the New Testament on slavery. And so whether you're looking at the Old Testament on slavery, whether you're looking at Jesus on slavery, whether you're looking at Paul and Peter on slavery, it's all really the same message. And so the Christian does have a problem there. And so they will just, try to pretend like the New Testament doesn't make any effort to make social change. And you will see this argument in documents throughout the church, in publications and things like that. If you dig into some of the original documents and letters and the newsletters and circulars that they wrote, they made this kind of argument all the time. People make this argument today. Yes, the reason why the New Testament doesn't condemn slavery is because they're not trying to, God's people are not trying to overturn social systems today, which is just not true in the least bit. And they're very inconsistent because they will make that particular argument for slavery. But when it comes to other things, then they're happy to say, oh, yes, Jesus was definitely overturning the social systems of the time.
Right. It doesn't work. The argument doesn't work in every context. Well, and yet those verses that you just cited that we were talking about, these are the ones that are claimed by slave masters during the slavery era. They are preached to their slaves because in addition to Frederick Douglass's biography or autobiography, there was another book I read called 30 Years a Slave. I don't know if you've come across it, by Lewis Hughes. And this is a fascinating book. It's also on Spotify as well. But it's an extraordinary example of a person who grew up. He was born into the slave system in the South. He lived during the Civil War, and after the Civil War, he was able to escape because of the chaos around Memphis where he lived at the time, and he escaped to Canada. Now, one of the things Lewis Hughes talks about, he says, I can't understand, some of the Christian masters are some of the cruelest people, like Frederick Douglass says the same thing. And he says, yet on Sunday, they'll go to their church and sing about, loving God and loving their fellow man. and on the same afternoon come back and whip their slaves within an inch of their life. And you couldn't understand that juxtaposition, as he was learning how to read and he's reading the Bible, and he's saying, none of this makes sense. They're preaching those verses to us about how we should submit to our masters as unto the Lord. And they're going to church on a Sunday, singing, praying, and coming home on the same day and whipping a slave for the most minor of infractions.
When we come back from the break, we're going to get even more into this issue of arguments that have been advanced by Christians, both in the past as well as currently, even progressive Christians, for defending slavery from the Bible. Then we're going to get into a deep dive of some Old Testament passages and take a really hard look at some of the justifications for slavery. In fact, the Bible does condone slavery, and we're going to look at those in depth later on and see what kind of conclusions we can draw from the whole thing. As you know, I've been doing this series on Doug Wilson, and I've battled a cold right now, so my voice is a little bit rough, but this is what's happening in our series. We're getting into the end of this thing now. We've got another couple episodes coming up. We've got one with Dr. Nick Geyer, and he's, of course, Doug Wilson's former professor of philosophy at the University of Idaho back in the 1970s, and I was able to catch up with him a while ago. In fact, speaking of which, this episode with David Johnson was recorded so long ago, I was actually going to release it a lot sooner. And then toward the end, we start getting into the Mindshift Zoom call that David was appearing actually back in October of 2022. So this recording is a little bit dated, but I went ahead and left it in because it reminded me that, in fact, David Johnson's coming back now to talk about this episode. We're going to talk about a Christian or biblical defense of slavery in our February Mindshift Zoom call. And that call is actually scheduled a couple days after this episode drops. It's going to be on the 19th of Feb at 8 o'clock UK time. So we're going to have David Johnson back again. And then for the month of March, I've got Sam Terode. He's contacted me. He's part of our Closed Mindship Podcast Facebook group. He's got a fascinating story, and he wanted to drop in as the guest in March. So look for that coming up. How can you get access to these calls? These are great Zoom calls. We had one with Kate West last month. It was really good. I've uploaded that to the Patreon page as well as our Closed Mindship Podcast Facebook group. These are benefits that you get by supporting the show on Patreon. You can get access to these calls. We do them once a month. You can meet former guests, and it's a great way to kind of talk to them, get to meet them, get to know them a little bit for an hour. We do them around about the third Sunday of every month. So like I say, we're going to have David coming back on the 19th and then Sam in the month of March. And then I was mentioning what's coming up in the next couple of episodes. We've got this episode with Dr. Nick Geyer dropping next, and then we're going to look at this issue of the final one, the toxic legacy of Doug Wilson. I want to look at, I've got at least 4, but maybe more sort of guys that are in his orbit, people that are taking his biblical patriarchy, his Christian patriarchy message into some really disturbing places. One of these things is something called the manosphere, if you've heard of it. This is something I'm going to unpack in more detail in that episode. We'll look at maybe 4, depending on how much time we've got. It's going to be another long episode. I'm actually working on it now, putting all the research together. But I'm going to look at his toxic legacy sort of as we conclude this look at Doug Wilson. And then I've got some other interviews lined up. I've got one with Elgin Strait. I met him a while back ago. He's an American living in the UK. He lives down in London. He's a former Moonie. And we're going to do something in March. I think he might be our guest for our Mindshift Zoom call in April. So we've got some stuff coming up with him. And I've also got an interview scheduled with Vinnie Kocius. And she's a former cult member. She was raised in a cult, and she wrote a book. I think it's called Cult Child. So we're in the process of setting that up. And so we've got some stuff in the pipeline, really good stuff. We're kind of getting back into some cult psychology and things like that, talking to former cult survivors and whatnot. So, and then the other thing, really quick, I'll just mention, I'm lining up now another presentation with the Atheists of Florida. I've done a couple for them before, and I contacted them the other day, and I said, I have an idea for one based on all this research I've done on Doug Wilson and biblical patriarchy in general. I want to talk about the toxic effects of Christian or biblical patriarchy. So we're in the process of lining up a date with the Atheists of Florida, and as that gets closer, I'll put the links out so you can drop in on that call. It's a Zoom call. It's normally about an hour long. I do about a 45-minute presentation, and then there's time, about 15, 20 minutes for Q&A afterwards. I've done one on Dominion theology. I've done one on cults, and it's always gone down really well. I've just absolutely enjoyed talking to the people that drop into these meetings for AOF. So that's something that's in the pipeline coming up. So anyway, let's get on back into the chat with David Johnson. We're going to look at this issue of a Christian or biblical defense of slavery, looking at some more of these arguments that have been advanced, and then taking a deep dive at some of these biblical passages. So let's go back into the chat with David Johnson.
That actually takes me to another one of the justifications for slavery that you'll sometimes hear from Christians, when they're justifying biblical slavery, and oftentimes they will use this to justify Southern slavery as well. And it is that the slave was actually a prized possession. He was a valuable member of the household, treated well, and almost never, it would have been a rare thing to treat a slave cruelly or brutally. And so for an idea of the biblical justification for this, they will often say, look, Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt.
Right.
And he was the second, he gained position to be the second in command in all of Egypt. So you see, Timmy.
Right. Hey. Little Johnny, little Susie. Teaching this to children. That's the worst part, isn't it? This is you got the flannel graphs on the board and everything. I can remember those going to Sunday school as a kid.
Right. See, the slaves were well educated. They were given great jobs and positions of responsibility and power. And even in the South, there are situations where slaves learn to write and do the bookkeeping, and you can find examples of this. Of course, you can.
Sure.
Where some masters found it advantageous to have educated house slaves.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because Lewis Hughes, that book, 30 Years a Slave, he, as a young boy, his master was a doctor, and he taught young Lewis how to heal people, and he taught him medicines and things like that, exactly as you say, with a view that young Lewis could grow up and be a valuable assistant to him and help heal his sick slaves and things like that. So there's an example. And then later in life, Lewis becomes a dentist assistant after he becomes a free man. So you could make the case, yeah, look, he wouldn't have had that position had he not been trained by this white master of a doctor when he was a young boy. You see, it was advantageous, wasn't it?
Right. And so if you just kind of look at a couple of examples like that and shut the door on it, which is what the Christian will want you to do, don't look closer. They want to hold up these examples as the typical idea of slavery, the thing
that's how the whole system was. Yeah.
Right. That cruelty was very rare, and that people were very, very lucky to be slaves. I'll throw one other thing in here before the obvious debunking. They will point to history, first of all, in the Old Testament, because I try to show the biblical side of this too. It kind of starts there. They will show where slaves would often choose to stay with their masters rather than be free.
Right.
That is true. We can make a case for that.
There is evidence of that.
And there is evidence that slaves in the South, when they were freed, many of them stayed on and became workers on the plantation.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this is true, but incomplete. Right. So biblically speaking, just addressing that one first, most slaves actually weren't treated like Joseph. and Joseph, one gets the feeling, was already pretty well educated when he went into slavery, and he was useful to the king because he could interpret dreams. There is a very special set of circumstances where God ushered Joseph through this. For the average person, you had rules for slave owners, such as you can beat them to within an inch of their lives. Now, if they die, you're going to be held responsible. But if they live, you're okay. So the reason you had laws like that is because beating slaves would have been pretty common. No,
right.
Sorry, pretty common. And the reason in American slavery, you would have slaves that would stay on as opposed to going to do something else is because where would they go?
Right. Yeah. Where are they going to go?
Right. As soon as slavery is abolished, Jim Crow is there. So where exactly in society is the average slave without education going to go make their stand? They're not. They know how to do one thing and one thing only. They can work a field, and guess what? The master of the cotton field still needed someone to work the cotton field. So
work still needed to be done. Because in the case of Frederick Douglass and Lewis Hughes, Douglass had learned to be a ship's caulker, which is back in those days caulking between the planks of the ships, and he picked up that trade. And after he escaped, he was able to find employment doing the same thing. So he had a skill, and with this Lewis Hughes, he had a medical background. So in those guys' cases, they were lucky, I suppose, that they had sort of marketable skills. But yeah, if you're working in the field all your life, that's the only skill you've actually
you're not going to go to some employer and fill out an application and get a job. That's simply not going to happen.
That's how it works. Yeah.
Even the slaves that were lucky enough to escape to the North, they didn't find a terribly welcoming situation there because the North was also struggling with employment. And, they didn't have slaves in the North, but they had some pretty bad work situations there, and there still wasn't enough jobs for people. And so the North wasn't particularly all that welcoming to freed slaves who now are trying to compete for the very few jobs that were there. So the best arrangement for so many of them would have been to stay exactly where they were and keep working and doing the thing that they're doing. So
right. It wasn't proof that the system was so great that they didn't want to leave.
Right. No, they would have left in a heartbeat had they had any
somewhere to go.
Right.
And a lot of them ended up in Canada and different places. Well, that's the route that Wilson and Wilkins go that you just articulated. Their argument is that slavery as it existed in the South, this is from their book, Southern Slavery as It Was, they say it was a relationship based on mutual affection and confidence. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world. And they go on to say, slave life was to them, the slaves, a life of plenty of simple pleasures of food, clothes, and good medical care. So this is Wilson's argument that they had it great. They really did. These examples of cruelty, as you say, were rare, few and far between, and it was all done in a biblical sense. So these slave owners in the South, yes, they owned slaves, but they did it according to biblical rules. So therefore, it was all sanctioned and okayed by God.
Right. And the Holocaust didn't happen either.
Rushdoony was a Holocaust denier as well.
Right. So
you'll throw that in there.
It's very convenient to say things and just rewrite history because there's always going to be a certain contingent of people who don't study history, who know nothing about history, but to somehow paint slavery as a mutual system,
mutually beneficial for all parties involved.
Right, a mutually beneficial system to all parties involved is to simply lie about the status of history. It is to know nothing of the Middle Passage. So I don't even think we need to spend too much time on that. But these are some of the things that supporters of biblical slavery and what I would imagine people who are supporters of a kind of a modern day slavery, these are some of the justifications that they would make. And so if you will permit me an indulgence, do you have time for an indulgence?
Sure. There's always time for an indulgence.
Okay. I need some indulgence.
We all do, I think.
I just want to read a text or two from Scripture that everybody knows. And the only thing better than me reading the text would be you reading the text. Do you have a Bible?
Yes, but I can get on Bible Gateway quicker.
That's what I mean by a Bible.
Yeah. I've actually got a Bible on my monitor stand is a big old family Bible that somebody gave me years ago. It's perfect for a monitor stand, but I haven't opened it in years. Okay, so what text do you want to look at? I'm on BibleGateway.com.
I'm doing this off of memory, so just bear with me. I might have to plot around.
Right.
Leviticus, let's do Leviticus 25. And let's start with 39.
Verse 39. If your memory's any good, then it must be pretty good. So the NIV, 35. Okay, so it says
39.
if 39?
35 is too early.
All right, so 39 through what?
Through, let's say, 46.
Yeah, your memory's pretty good. Okay, here we go. So it says, verse 39, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. I think it's worth mentioning the context. Moses is speaking to the Israelites just before they're going into the promised land. That's what we're happening here, right?
Yes.
So it goes on there, to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God.
Let me stop you right there.
Right? I'm just getting going here, David. I'm about to preach a sermon in this thing.
I think verse 44, if I'm not mistaken. So there are two groups that he's going to be addressing. He's addressing the Israelites, but he's addressing two types of slaves right here. I chose this because this is really the most clear passage on slavery. The Old Testament has a lot of things to say about slavery, and sometimes it's all over the map. So he's saying, for the Israelites, for those of you who are my chosen people, all right?
Yeah, that's the distinction.
Some of you are gonna, mess up and get dirt poor. Okay, I get that, and you're gonna want to sell yourself into slavery because you're the only asset you've got. But you Israelites can't buy each other that way.
Right?
You can't own each other that way. Even if someone wants to sell themselves to you because they're in financial trouble, you can't do it. This is the upshot of the first couple of verses there. Instead, you have to treat them like a hired worker.
Yeah, as indentured servants.
Right. You can give them a job and for a time of service, but you can't own them. Okay, so that's the first part of it, because you're Jews and God freed you from slavery. You're special. You got a special place in his heart, and you can't go around enslaving each other when he freed you. So you gotta treat them like hirelings.
Right. So that's the first point of your 3-point sermon.
Yeah. So also one other note: the year of Jubilee. So this happened every 7 years. This doesn't mean 7 years from the time that you went into the service, whatever that 7th year was. So my understanding is if they went into service with you on year 6, they'll serve you for 1 year. Year of Jubilee was absolute. Everything, everyone had to be.
Right. So it wasn't 7 years from the time you were hired. It could be 6 years and 6 months, and you work 6 months and then you're free. You go back to your clans and to your people and all that.
Right. Jubilee was a fixed time.
Right.
So So that's the first piece of this. Now, the thing to understand about this too is when Christians start defending biblical slavery, they will often read that part of the text that you just read and stop. Because they understand that their audience has never read this text. In fact, who knows? They may not have ever read this
Most
text.
people never read Deuteronomy.
If you ever, if this is all you read, then it sounds like, okay, well, slavery isn't really slavery. It really is just a job. It even says there, you got to treat them like a hireling. So they will say, you see, that's not slavery. Pick up at verse 44.
Right. So we got point number 1. Now point number 2, going on, verse 44. He says, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them, you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly.
Right. So that last bit there kind of goes back to the first part we read from verse 39 to 43. You can't rule over them ruthlessly. Now, these other guys that you get from the nations around you,
that's fair game, baby.
Them be slaves. Okay. Those are, you see the distinction that's being made. On the one hand, you've got hired workers. On the other hand, you got slaves. The people from the nations around you, slaves. Where did these slaves come from? How did they become slaves? Because if you're buying a slave, someone's got to be selling a slave, right? So who's selling these people into slavery? These are actually the people's families. Well, I want to look at one more passage so that I can show you this too. But these are the people's families, fathers selling their children into slavery, and you can buy them. And when you buy them, you can not only own them as property, you can pass them down to your children in such a way, once again, just these things you just read, so that they're slaves forever. They're perpetual slaves.
You can pass them down to your children.
Never not be slaves. They will be slaves until they die. I don't care how much they would like to be free. They are property. The Christian fails in this area. So let me get you to read 2 other short passages. They're right next to each other. Exodus 21.
Okay. I was just going to say, before we jump out of Deuteronomy, there's another third point, and that's your third point of your sermon. He goes on to say that if there's a foreigner living in Israel and they become rich, now a Jew could sell themselves to that foreigner.
Yes.
But he goes on to say they retain the right of redemption after they've sold themselves, or a relative can redeem them. So in other words, an Israelite could be a slave of a foreigner, but even that's limited. They can be redeemed or bought back at the year of Jubilee. So there's always an exemption for the Israelites, whereas
Jubilee no matter what. But they can buy it back before then.
Yeah. So an Israelite can't own a fellow Israelite, but a foreigner could. But even there's a caveat. They can be redeemed. So there's that distinction. Okay. So what was the Exodus passage?
Exodus 21. So we're going to read these out of order.
Right. Okay.
So read verse 16. This is the Christian's favorite passage. So let's give him that first.
So he says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession.
Okay. So you see, Southern slavery was evil because they kidnapped people from Africa and brought them to America. The Bible doesn't condone that. And also, that couldn't have been what was going on in the Bible, because it says right here, that's not condoned. If you did that, you'd be put to death. Okay, a couple of things. I don't play the Hebrew card very often.
You're going to play it now.
I don't even know if I am going to play it. Let me just say that if you read study Bibles and you look at the word kidnap, and even some maybe older translations, you will see the word is someone who steals another person. So that could be a slightly different thing than what we think of as kidnapping. I know it sounds the same, and it's
right.
It's
a nuance.
That, yeah, it's a nuance. So if you steal a person, if you think about that for a moment, what you can steal is property. So it is among all things possible that what this is saying is if you steal another man's slave, because another man's slave was property. It just said so.
Right.
over in Deuteronomy where we were. So this might be an injunction, for instance, not to steal other people's slaves, because that would be in the second set of 10 commandments. The "thou should not covet thy neighbor's wife" actually reads more like "thou should not covet thy neighbor's slave, donkey, or wife."
Right.
They're kind of all in the
lumped in there
category there, and so I tend to believe that this is what that is dealing with. Nonetheless, we can deal with the word kidnap, but we know that it doesn't actually mean you can't forcibly take someone as a slave, because one of the three ways you became a slave in the Old Testament was you were conquered in war and you were taken as a war price. Some people literally went into your land and took you as a slave. So we can put an asterisk by that. I think the Christians maybe celebrate too much with that passage and would like to move on very quickly before there. But the other passage, your same page, I'm sure, verse 7 of Exodus 21.
Well, just before I read that, I was going to say Dabney. I mentioned R.L. Dabney. He was an apologist in the pre-Civil War and after the Civil War for a Christian defense of slavery, and he talks about this verse, and he says, look, we're off the hook in the South. We're not the ones kidnapping them from Africa. It was the British or the Arabs or it was somebody else. We're actually doing the slaves a favor when they do wash up on our shores by buying them and sort of rehabilitating them as we're in a Christian sort of way. So we're not culpable for kidnapping them, so we're not furthering that system. We're making the best out of a bad situation, so even back in the 19th century, there was that defense of this kind of problem, huh? Okay, so verse 7, is that what you're saying?
Yes, this is, you will never, the people who read verse 16, they will never read verse 7.
It whiz over verse 7. Okay, so verse 7 says, if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. Should we keep going?
You can if you want. The rules for female slaves and male slaves were different. And so here's where I will cop to a little bit of ignorance. You remember back in Deuteronomy, we were saying that, okay, the Jewish slaves, you couldn't keep them forever.
Right. They had to be redeemed every 7 years.
But I'm pretty sure that would have been men, Jewish men. And he's giving a different rule for the girls. And so does this apply just to the foreign female slaves, or does this also apply to Jewish female slaves? I suspect it probably, considering their laws toward women, probably apply to Jewish female slaves as well. But what this passage shows, and we could talk for an hour about the differences between male and female.
Sure.
Slaves. But this shows that actually there is a category of slave that could always be considered property and couldn't go free. And there were certain ways that they could go free. There were certain things, you could marry them, and then let me stop for a moment. You could have sex with them, and if you decided they weren't pleasing you, you would have to sell them back.
Right.
Not give them back. You would have to sell them back, or give them a chance to be bought back. Or if you bought a slave for your son, and your son didn't like her after, trying out the merchandise,
right? Trying out the goods,
right? So, we're talking about sex slavery, but in the Jewish system is almost indistinguishable from marriage, to be honest, because marriage is kind of a type of sex slavery, because a man could marry a woman and divorce her simply by writing, I divorce you, and so I'm not entirely sure how different a woman sold in slavery was to a typical wife. But one of the things that you will hear Christians say, if they do address this passage at all, is, well, you see, these women would have gained the rights and privileges of a wife. And my question would be, can you delineate for me what the rights and privileges of a wife were at that time?
Well, the passage itself does, because I'm looking at earlier verses 2 and following. So he says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he serves you for 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. So there's your year of Jubilee thing. If he comes alone, he goes away alone. If he has a wife, when he comes, she can go with him. Now, the critical thing, if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master. Only the man gets to go free. So right there's a distinction between the male and female children and the slave, or the servant, I should say, in the Hebrew servant case. So yeah, there's all these little distinctions between
this is one
male and female servants.
History of loopholes.
Ultimate loophole.
Yeah. What this would be, the way this would work is a man would sell himself into slavery for a time, and he is what the shrewd master would do is give this male slave a wife.
Exactly.
He would give the slave a wife who is also a slave.
Right. Knowing that if she had children, they still belong to the master.
Right.
Because then the passage goes on to say, if the slave turns around and says, wait a minute, I love my master, I want to stay, because of course he can't take his wife and kids with him. Then they do the whole thing. They jam him up against the door. They pierce his ear with an awl, and then he becomes, part of that household. It was a very wily strategy.
There's a song sang in Christian youth camps called "Pierce My Ear."
I've never heard that one. Oh man, that's reference to this passage. We're slaves of Christ.
To this passage, and the idea is that you are telling God, I don't want to go free. Pierce my ear, take me to the door this day. Because
my God, that's horrifying. Why have I never heard this song, David?
Sing this song. They don't understand
the historical context of this passage.
Right. But if this slave wants to actually keep his wife and kids, he wants to keep his family together, then he would have to go back to the master and say, okay, I'll stay. And then he basically sells his right as a human being.
Right. You're now a servant.
Right. So this is the beautiful, fair, loving system that Christians are defending.
Mm-hmm.
So if we could go on a long time like this.
We're way into the weeds now, aren't we?
Right. You're right. There's so much that you can say about biblical slavery, and it's fun for me anyway. It's how I think. But you don't need to work this hard. So anyone listening to this, and you hear some of these arguments maybe presented by Christians, and you're thinking, okay, well, let me see, where here in this passage it says, okay, let me get this right. You don't have to do any of that. Just
right. So what's the shortcut? What's the answer then?
Here's a shortcut. Okay. You can just ask them the question that I have asked on every podcast that I've ever discussed this on with a Christian. And you will get the same blank stare. The argument is over the moment you say, okay, tell you what, never mind what I think biblical slavery was. Let's just take your idea of biblical slavery. Is that something that you condone today? Is that something that you think would be good for your son or daughter today? Would you be okay if your daughter was confined to biblical slavery?
Mm-hmm.
Answer is, of course not.
Yeah.
That's when you will start getting equivocations like, yeah, well, but it was good for those people at that time, place, not for us today. And they, in saying that, they just undermine everything that they've been saying for the last 30 or 40 minutes. The fact is, they do not believe it is good. They still think it is evil. They still think it's terrible. They do not want to see it today. They do not want to be a slave in a system, in the best slavery system they could think of. They would fight tooth and nail to keep their children out of the best slavery system they can think of. And so at the end of the day, it's just BS. And you can expose it with a single question. Don't even open the Bible. Don't write down these passages. Don't look at them again. They're awful. You don't need them.
Yep. And yet you get a guy like John MacArthur. And this is exactly where he takes it, because I came across a clip not long ago where it's from 2012, and he starts defending slavery on the same kind of line that Doug Wilson and Wilkins did. And he takes it into, he says, well, we need to take another look at this whole thing. If you had a good master, if you had a master that was, treating you along biblical lines, as it were, as in a just system, that wouldn't be so bad. And he says for a lot of poor people, it was actually a pretty good deal. They couldn't have found a better life. Then he takes it into, yes, but as Christians, we're slaves of Christ. So we have a just master. We have a fair master. We've got a loving master. So to be a slave, and all through the New Testament, Paul uses that language. We are slaves of Christ. And he talks about that as a model of what Christianity should be. So that's where MacArthur takes it. He says, look, to be a slave of Christ is the best thing we could ever hope for. So you can see where they'll take it on that line.
Right. But as a slave of Christ, I bet he didn't leave his family like Christ.
Exactly.
It's to do. And I bet he didn't sell all of his possessions and give the money to the poor. And so
it's all spiritualized.
Right. He's a slave to Christ in name only. He's not actually a slave to anybody. So one of the equivocations that Christians will sometimes make is that, if you have a job, it's slavery. It's not. Okay. This is just one of the redefinitions that they will try to in false equivocations. Well, biblical slavery was like maybe a not so great job today. Wrong. I guarantee you would rather have a bad job today anywhere, a bad job worse than the best slavery you can come up with.
Exactly. It's a horrible system. And if people are interested, I would really encourage, if you haven't read Frederick Douglass or Lewis Hughes, 12 Years a Slave, some of those books, they're out there. They're available for free on Spotify. I sound like I'm pushing Spotify, but because they're free audiobooks, you can get them on Spotify for nothing. It's an eye-opening and sort of experience of what these men lived through, what they experienced with their families during that very period you were talking about. Was it such a good system? Absolutely not. They were constantly trying to escape. What struck me about Frederick Douglass was the story about how he learned how to read. If people had ever read that book by Douglass, it's unbelievable. He was so desperate to learn how to read. He was like bribing school children on the streets with food that he would hoard from his own meals, going hungry, and they would take their books home from school and teach him the letters. So they taught him the alphabet in back alleys and things like that. And he taught himself basically how to read off the back of learning the alphabet. And it's just the struggle, the human will to sort of overcome all these barricades that were placed in front of him. Once he learned how to read, that opened the world up to him, and it just goes from there. He started learning about other countries of the world don't have slavery. This is an aberration here. America is not normal. and that opened his eyes to the reality. Hey, this system is deeply, deeply flawed. And he already knew that experientially, of course, growing up in that system, but now he knew it was true because that was all sheltered from them. These slave owners did not want their slaves to learn how to read for that very reason. They'd be exposed to, alternative ideas, seditious ideas. And that's exactly what, happened to Douglas.
Are you familiar with something called the Slave Bible?
I've heard of it. Yeah, I think you need to tell us what it is.
So there may be a more official name for it, but it would be pretty easy to Google. The Slave Bible was cut down, had about 90 or so % of the full text of the Bible cut out. And it had passages, pro-slavery passages, but it had other passages removed, such as the people of God crying out for freedom.
Yes. When the Israelites were slaves in Egypt.
Right. That's the freedom of the slaves, that's cut out. And, things like there's neither slave nor free in Galatians. That's out of
That's
there.
Gone.
So any kind of pro-human passage that suggested a type of equality among people, that was removed. This was the Bible that slave masters taught their slaves.
Right. They could read that Bible.
Right.
Or maybe not read it, but yeah.
Or some derivation of it.
Right.
When blacks were taught to read, they were taught to read the Bible.
Sure.
That was the textbook for many blacks learning to read, but they were taught to read by white masters who had an agenda.
Absolutely. A vested interest.
Even if they didn't have this particular cut down Bible, they had a particular spin on all of the passages and stories that would make the slaves better slaves. So one of the things that was true in our history, in the Churches of Christ, slaves were not originally allowed baptism. This is true in American history.
Right.
In general, blacks didn't have souls. This was an idea. It didn't live long, but that was part of the idea. And slave owning Christians were deeply against teaching the Bible to their slaves, but they were kind of sold a way of doing it so that if we teach them the Bible, certain passages of the Bible in a certain way, they would actually be better slaves, loyal to us, and they would give us better service.
Right, they'd be more docile.
Yeah,
because they're serving as unto God in that sense, then, aren't they?
Exactly.
Submit to your masters, and everything Paul says.
Their first education in reading was often from someone teaching them the Bible in a particular way for the purpose of making them a better slave.
Right. From the white man's point of view, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah, less troublesome and more obedient and all the rest of it.
Yes.
Not wanting to escape and everything else.
And also, I mean, this is kind of, I don't want to get too far afield here, but the black church today still has tendrils of this, stretching all the way from that history, because a lot of the black worship and black communion has to do with looking forward beyond this time to a time when there will be justice and peace and equality. The white man could look to the now and cry out for relief now for whatever problems they were having. But if you were black and enslaved, your hope was in serving the Lord faithfully and then getting a prize after this life. That's very useful, because that way a person who is under the thumb of a slave owner, they can understand the promises of God as something in the future after death. And so they can remain docile and faithful and prayerful here and now. And a lot of Black worship really focuses on that time and place beyond the sky.
Mm-hmm.
That they're not so much looking at the here and now for the justice. They're looking for the justice, from a theological perspective.
Sure.
Heaven is their justice, and they are to be faithful in suffering in the here and now. So, we that history hasn't left us completely today. That's still a part of us and still a part of Black worship.
Absolutely. And that's something I learned from the episode that you and I did. I was going to say, so the two takeaways I get from this conversation now is the one thing about what I'm trying to educate people, because guys like Doug Wilson, he's got such a huge platform. He's being platformed by John Piper and other people in that sort of orbit. And there's a lot of backstory to Doug Wilson that people don't know. And this is one of them. So you've got this defense of slavery that ends up in Christian homeschooling curriculum. That's a real concern. And then what you brought to the table in that episode was this idea of the deep-seated racism in the white church and how we see that even today coming through. So I would encourage people to go back and find that episode that you and I talked about, because this is kind of the backstory behind a lot of what we talked about in that episode. Now, I know we need to wrap it up. You said we could talk for 3 hours about this. I think we could. We need to probably revisit this. But the good news is you're going to be coming back in October for our monthly Mindshift Zoom call. So if people want to find out more about this, let me know, and I will get you on that call with David. So I'm really looking forward to having you back in October.
Good. That'll be fun. You can ask me all kinds of questions about red letters. I will not give answers like, go buy the book for $4.99.
You can get it for free.
Yeah, I won't even give that answer. I will answer all questions fully. I will not hold anything back. So,
yes, we had a great time before.
If you're gonna come and ask me about that, I'll be prepared to talk about all that.
Right. So we'll talk about red letter. The other thing I was going to say before we go, and that is when you were talking about your Sunday sermon, Skeptics and Seekers, I don't know if you ever have guests on there, but I would love to be a part of that, because when I did my doctoral dissertation, it was on homiletics. It was on preaching. I went all the way back, studied Greek rhetoric, did all this stuff, broke the whole thing down. So I loved analyzing sermons anyway when I was an evangelical. So I would, if there's a way to be a part of that, I would plug me into a sermon,
I would love, and
we'll tear it apart and break it down. So if that's on the table, I would love to be a part of that. So
I invite people to come and sit in the pew with me, and
I'd love it.
Sermon with me. So no one has taken me up on it. They listen to the show.
I'll be a pew sitter. If I can make my objections and my points, that's the one thing you never have when you're sitting in a pew. You have to listen to what the preacher says. So you have to just, whatever you're thinking, you can't just stand up and say, that's bullshit. I don't believe that. You vote with your feet and go out. So that would be great. So let's see, the last couple of things. Then how do people find you? You mentioned your show. Is that the best way, just to go on the Patreon site and find you on the Red Letters podcast?
From my perspective, that's the best way to do it. But
sure.
Actually, for if you don't want to pay me $1, fine, keep your $1.
Keep your damn $1. You cheapskate. Yeah, man. Cheap bastards out there.
You can actually pay more than $1 if you like. I mean, you can.
Right. You don't have to just do $1.
No, but you can just send me an email at skepticsandseekers@gmail.com, or you can send me an email to redlettersbook@gmail.com, or you can send an email to my personal email at .com.
That's not going to happen. Is that kissmyass.com? I think that's what you said last time. I asked you, where can people find you? I think it was kissmyass.com, something like to that effect.
I'm a bad man.
That hasn't changed. All right, listen, I'm going to let you go, man. I am so looking forward to meeting back up with you in October for this Mindshift Zoom call. Thank you so much, David. Again, absolutely fantastic. Love doing the red letters too with you. I'd love to be a part of that Skeptics and Seekers, so we can figure out something there too.
All right. Thank you.